The cold steel of a suppressed Beretta pressed into the hollow of my throat, smelling of gun oil and expensive tobacco. Rainwater streaked the face of the man looming over me, his charcoal suit absorbing the moonlight like a black hole. In his other hand he held the battered, leather wallet I had spent 4 hours tracking him down to return. "Nobody finds me unless I want to be found, little bird," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that rattled my teeth. Behind him, 3 black SUVs sat idling, their headlights cutting through the fog of the pier like the eyes of predators. My fingers were still caked with the grime of the subway tunnels, my oversized hoodie soaked through to my skin. I had spent my last $3 on a bus ticket to find the owner of this wallet, thinking I was doing a good deed. Now the owner was deciding whether to pull the trigger or push me into the black Atlantic. I didn't know then that the man holding the gun was Silas Vane, the ghost king of the city's underground. I didn't know that the worn photograph of a little girl tucked behind his credit cards was the only leverage left in a war that had already claimed a dozen lives. I was just Maya, a girl who lived in the spaces people forgot to look, trying to keep a shred of my soul intact in a city that traded in shadows. If I had known that returning $50 and a piece of leather would put me at the center of a Mafia execution, I would have let the wallet rot in the gutter. But the look in Silas's eyes when he saw that photo told me I had stumbled into a story that wouldn't let me go until the last drop of blood was spilled. The wind whipped across the pier, stinging my eyes. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, metal edge of a discarded razor blade I kept for protection. Silas didn't flinch, but the 2 giants behind him shifted, their hands moving inside their jackets. I pulled out the wallet, the leather dark with rain, and held it out with a hand that refused to stop shaking. "I found it near the 42nd Street station," I said, the words catching in my throat. "I saw your face on a business card inside. I didn't touch the money." Silas lowered the gun an inch, his eyes darting from my face to the wallet. He snatched it, flipping it open with practiced ease. His thumb traced the edge of the small, faded photo inside. For a split second, the mask of the killer slipped. His jaw tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple. He looked back at the SUVs, then at me, his gaze scanning my tattered shoes and the dirt under my fingernails. "You traveled 10 miles in a storm to return $50 you could have used to buy a warm bed?" He stepped closer, the scent of cedarwood and rain following him. "I don't keep things that don't belong to me," I snapped, the fire in my gut momentarily overriding the ice in my veins. I turned to walk away, my boots squelching in the puddles. I didn't get 3 steps before a heavy hand slammed onto my shoulder, spinning me around. "The 42nd Street station is watched by the Moretti family," Silas said, his eyes narrowing into slits. "If they saw you pick this up, you're already a walking corpse. They don't believe in coincidences, Maya." The sound of screeching tires tore through the rhythm of the rain. 2 silver sedans roared onto the pier, their headlights blinding us. Doors flew open and men with submachine guns poured out, their movements clinical and synchronized. "Vane," a voice barked over the wind. "Give us the girl and the ledger and we might let you keep your tongue." Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the front of my hoodie and hauled me toward the nearest SUV. "Get in or die," he hissed. Bullets began to chew through the wooden crates nearby, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. I dove into the leather-scented darkness of the vehicle just as the windows shattered into a million diamonds. Silas scrambled in after me, shouting at the driver. The SUV lurched forward, the engine roaring like a wounded beast, as we raced toward the edge of the pier with the silver sedans hot on our heels. The driver swerved, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt as we plummeted off the end of the pier. My stomach hit my throat, the world turning upside down for a heartbeat before we slammed onto the deck of a waiting cargo barge. The impact rattled my brain, the taste of copper filling my mouth. Silas was already out the door, firing back at the pier as the barge began to pull away into the mist. He looked down at the wallet in his hand, then at me, his face unreadable. "What ledger?" I gasped, clutching my bruised ribs. Silas tossed the wallet into my lap. "Look behind the lining of the photo, Maya. You didn't just return a wallet. You delivered the keys to an empire." I pried the leather apart, my fingers numb. Tucked deep inside was a micro-SD card, no bigger than a fingernail. I looked up at Silas, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The Morettis weren't after him for the money. They were after the data I had been carrying in my pocket for the last 4 hours. "Now they know your face," Silas said, checking the magazine of his Beretta. "And in this city, knowing a face is the same as owning it." He looked toward the receding shoreline, where the lights of the silver sedans were still circling like sharks. He reached out, his hand hovering over mine for a second before he pulled back. Welcome to the war, little bird. Try not to get your wings clipped in the first hour. I looked at the microSD card, then at the man who had just saved my life after threatening to end it. The barge drifted further into the fog, the city's skyline disappearing into a wall of gray. That's when I heard a rhythmic thumping from above. A helicopter. The searchlight cut through the mist, sweeping across the deck until it landed squarely on us. Silas cursed, grabbing a flare gun from the deck. Get below deck. Now. I scrambled toward the hatch, but the helicopter opened fire. The deck plates erupted in a line of sparks, heading straight for Silas. He dove to the left, but his foot caught on a heavy mooring line. He went down hard, the Beretta skittering across the deck and sliding into the black water. He was pinned, the searchlight pinning him like a moth to a board. Maya, he yelled. Take the card and run. I looked at the hatch, then at the man trapped in the light. I didn't run. I lunged for the flare gun he had dropped. My hands shook as I aimed it at the blinding eye in the sky. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that if he died, I was next. I pulled the trigger. The flare erupted in a scream of crimson light, streaking toward the cockpit. The helicopter veered sharply to avoid it, the searchlight swinging wildly away. In the chaos, I ran to Silas, my fingers clawing at the heavy rope trapping his ankle. You're an idiot, he grunted, pushing against the deck as the rope finally gave way. We're even, I retorted, hauling him toward the hatch. We tumbled into the dark, oily belly of the barge just as a second flare of gunfire chewed the wood where we had been standing. We were trapped in a metal box, the engine's vibration rattling our bones, with an army above us and a ledger in my pocket that everyone was willing to kill for. Silas leaned against the bulkhead, his breathing heavy, his eyes fixed on me with a strange, dark intensity. If you believe Maya deserves to survive the man she just saved, hit the like button so her story reaches those who know that even the smallest hands can tip the scales. The cargo hold smelled of rust and stale diesel. Silas dragged himself up, his silhouette jagged against the dim red emergency lights. He didn't thank me. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron bar and jammed it into the gears of the hatch, locking us in. The barge is heading for the dry docks in the North Ward, he said, his voice dropping to a rasp. It's Moretti territory. We have 20 minutes before they realize we're not jumping overboard. I can disappear, I said, my voice sounding small in the vast metal room. I've spent 3 years being invisible. I know the tunnels under the North Ward better than the people who built them. Silas walked toward me, his boots echoing on the metal floor. He stopped inches away, the heat from his body radiating through the cold air. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers surprisingly gentle. You don't understand, Maya? The ledger on that card? It's a list. Every judge, every cop, every politician the Morettas have in their pocket. But it's encrypted with a biometric key. My brother's key. Where's your brother? Silas's face darkened, the lines of his mouth turning into a hard, bitter line. He's the man they were torturing when I lost the wallet. He's the reason I was at the station. I failed him. Then we go get him, I said. Silas laughed, a hollow, jagged sound. You're a girl who sleeps on cardboard, Maya. They have an army. And I have the tunnels, I countered, stepping closer. They won't see me coming. I'm the ghost they forgot to be afraid of. Silas stared at me for a long time, the silence between us filled only by the rhythmic thumping of the barge's engine. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver locket. He pressed it into my hand. This belonged to my sister. The girl in the photo. If we get separated, find a man named Luca at the Broken Anchor pub. Show him this. He'll know what to do. The barge shuddered as it hit the dock bumpers. The sound of metal on metal was like a gong. Above us, we heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the deck. They were here. Stay behind me, Silas whispered, pulling a backup blade from his boot. The hatch groaned as someone tried to force it from the outside. The iron bar Silas had jammed into the gears began to bend. He looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his face. If we make it out of this, I'll buy you the best steak in the city. I'd settle for a hot shower and a bed without rats, I said. The hatch blew inward with a deafening roar. Smoke and flashbangs filled the room with a blinding white light. I dove behind a stack of shipping crates, my lungs burning. Through the haze, I saw Silas move like a blur of shadow and steel. He met the first man at the base of the ladder, his blade finding a gap in the man's armor with terrifying precision. I didn't wait to see the rest. I found the ventilation shaft I had spotted earlier and kicked the grate in. I scrambled inside, the cold metal scraping my shoulders. I looked back one last time and saw Silas surrounded by 4 men, his back against the bulkhead, his eyes looking for me. "Go," he roared. I crawled as fast as I could, the sounds of the struggle fading behind me. The vent led to a drainage pipe that emptied out into the muddy banks of the North Ward. I tumbled out into the muck, gasping for air. I didn't stop. I ran toward the maze of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses, the silver locket heavy in my hand. I reached the broken anchor, an hour later. It was a dive bar that smelled of spilled beer and desperation. I found Luca in a back booth, his face covered in scars that told a dozen stories of his own. I showed him the locket. His eyes widened and he stood up so fast his chair toppled. "Where is he?" "He's at the dry docks," I said. "And he's not alone." Luca grabbed a phone and barked a single word, "Assemble." Within minutes, the bar was filled with men who looked like they had been waiting for this call their entire lives. They didn't look like Mafia. They looked like the broken, the forgotten, the ones Silas had looked out for. If you believe the quiet girl from the tunnels is the only hope Silas has left, drop a like so the algorithm knows this story matters. We moved through the tunnels like a subterranean tide. I led them through the narrow, dripping passages, past the sleeping camps of the homeless, straight into the heart of the Moretti stronghold. We emerged in the basement of a repurposed meatpacking plant. The air was thick with the smell of iron and death. "He's on the 3rd floor," Luca whispered, checking his watch. "The girl stays here." "No," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I know the layout. There's a freight elevator they use for deliveries. I can get in through the roof." I didn't wait for his approval. I climbed the fire escape, my heart pounding against my ribs. I reached the roof and found the skylight. Looking down, I saw a room bathed in harsh, white light. Silas was strapped to a chair in the center, his face a mask of blood. Standing over him was a man in a white suit, holding a scalpel. "Where is the girl, Silas?" the man asked, his voice oily and smooth. "Where is the ledger?" Silas spat blood onto the man's pristine shoes. "She's halfway to the border by now, Moretti. You're chasing a shadow." Moretti raised the scalpel. "Then I'll just have to settle for your eyes." I didn't think. I kicked through the glass, raining shards down on them like a frozen storm. I landed on a table, the microSD card held high in my hand. "You want the ledger?" I screamed. "Come and get it." Moretti's guards turned, their guns rising. But they were too slow. Luca and his men burst through the doors, the room erupting into a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. I dove for Silas, my fingers fumbling with the heavy leather straps holding him down. You came back," Silas wheezed, his eyes struggling to focus. "I told you," I said, slicing through the last strap. "I don't keep things that don't belong to me. And your life belongs to you." The room was a blur of violence. Luca was a whirlwind of rage, his men tearing through the Moretti guards. Moretti himself tried to run, but Silas caught him by the throat, pinning him against the wall. Silas didn't use a gun. He just looked at him, his eyes filled with a cold, terrifying light. "My brother," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Where is he?" Moretti pointed a shaking finger toward a heavy steel door at the back of the room. Silas dropped him like a sack of trash and ran for the door. I followed, my heart in my throat. Inside the small, windowless room was a man who looked exactly like Silas, but broken. He was barely breathing, his body covered in burns. Silas collapsed next to him, his hands shaking as he touched his brother's face. "I've got you, Leo," he whispered. "I've got you." We carried Leo out through the tunnels, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. We reached a safe house on the edge of the city, a small apartment above a bakery. Silas spent the next 3 days sitting by his brother's bed, never closing his eyes. On the 4th day, Silas walked out onto the small balcony where I was watching the sunrise. He looked different. The hard edges were still there, but the mask was gone. He handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "A deed," he said. "To a house in the suburbs. Near a school. And a bank account that will ensure you never have to sleep in a tunnel again." I looked at the envelope, then at him. "Why?" "Because you reminded me that there's still something worth fighting for in this city," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the microSD card. He snapped it in half and dropped the pieces into the street below. "You just destroyed an empire," I said, stunned. "No," Silas said, looking at the horizon. "I destroyed a prison. We're starting over, Maya. All of us." He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and warm. "I still owe you that steak." "I think I'd prefer a home-cooked meal," I said, a smile finally touching my lips. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the people who found their light in the darkest corners of the world. The house was small, with a blue door and a garden that needed work. I stood in the doorway, the keys heavy in my hand, listening to the sound of birds instead of subways. Silas was standing at the gate, his brother leaning on his shoulder, both of them looking at the house like it was a miracle. I looked back at the city in the distance, the towers of glass and steel shimmering in the heat. I knew the shadows were still there. I knew the war wasn't truly over. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't a ghost. I was Maya. And I was home. I turned to Silas and nodded. He led his brother up the path, his steps steady, his head held high. As I closed the door, I felt the weight of the last few days lift from my shoulders. The ledger was gone, the Morettas were in hiding, and the tunnels were a lifetime away. I walked into the kitchen and saw a vase of fresh flowers on the counter. A note was tucked under it. For the ghost who saved us. I took a deep breath, the scent of lilies filling my lungs. I knew there would be challenges ahead. I knew Silas's world would always have a bit of darkness in it. But as I looked out the window at the quiet street, I knew I wouldn't trade this for anything. If this story moved you the way it moved me, leave a like so I know to tell more stories of hope and redemption. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the floor. I sat on the porch swing watching the world go by. Silas came out and sat next to me, handing me a glass of cold lemonade. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm perfect," I said. We sat in silence, watching the stars begin to poke through the twilight. I realized then that returning that wallet was the best thing I had ever done. Not because of the money or the house or the security, but because it had given me a family. And in this world, that was the only ledger that truly mattered. I leaned my head on Silas's shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep without one eye open, knowing that the man next to me would never let the shadows touch me again. The next morning, the smell of bacon woke me up. I walked downstairs to find Silas and Leo in the kitchen, arguing over how to flip a pancake. It was loud, it was messy, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I grabbed a spatula and pushed Silas aside. "Move, Vane. You're going to burn the house down before we even unpack." He laughed, a real genuine sound that echoed through the rooms. "I think she's the boss now, Leo." "She always was," Leo replied with a wink. We ate together, the sun streaming through the windows, the future stretching out before us like an open road. I knew who Silas was and I knew what he had done. But I also knew the man who had sat in the dark for 3 days, praying for his brother to wake up. As I washed the dishes, I saw a black SUV pull up to the curb. My heart skipped a beat, the old instinct screaming at me to run. But then the driver got out. It was Luca. He was carrying a box of books and a small orange kitten. He walked up the path and handed the kitten to me. "Silas said you needed a roommate." I took the tiny, purring creature and held it to my chest. I looked at Silas, who was trying to act like he hadn't planned the whole thing. "His name is Tiger," Silas said, not looking at me. "He's perfect," I whispered. Luca stayed for coffee and we spent the afternoon telling stories, not about the Mafia or the ledger but about the things we wanted to do now that we were free. Luca wanted to open a gym. Leo wanted to travel. And Silas? Silas just looked at me. "I think I'm exactly where I want to be." The shadows of the city felt a million miles away. We were the lucky ones. The ones who had found a way out. And as the kitten curled up on my lap, I knew that the girl who had returned a wallet was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, and someone who would never be invisible again. If you think everyone deserves a second chance, leave a like so this story finds the people who need it most. The months turned into a year. The garden flourished, the kitten grew into a cat, and the house with the blue door became the center of our world. We still kept an eye on the news, watching as the ripples from the ledger's destruction continued to wash away the old guard of the city. Silas and I walked through the park one afternoon, the leaves turning gold and red under our feet. He stopped by a bench and looked at me, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not a diamond but a simple band made of dark, polished steel, with a tiny emerald set into the inside. "It's a reminder," he said, "of where we came from, and why we'll never go back." I slipped it onto my finger, the metal cool and solid. "I don't need a ring to remember, Silas." "I know," he said, pulling me into his arms. "But I wanted you to have it anyway." We stood there in the fading light, two people who had survived the storm and found the shore. The city was still there but it no longer held us. We had written our own ending and it was better than anything I could have imagined. I looked at the ring, then at Silas and then at the path ahead. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The quiet of the suburbs was a lie. Even with the garden blooming and the blue door locked, the air in the house felt heavy. Silas sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on a burner phone that hadn't buzzed in months. Across from him, Leo was sketching, not blueprints for a new life, but the faces of the men who had broken him. I stood at the window, my fingers tracing the steel ring on my finger, watching a black sedan idle at the end of the block. "They're not coming to kill us, Silas," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "They're coming to negotiate." "There is no negotiation with a void, Maya," Silas rasped, finally looking up. "The Morettas are gone, but the vacuum they left is pulling everyone in. They want a new king. They think it's me." The front door didn't creak, it exploded. Not with a bomb, but with the sudden, overwhelming presence of men in suits who didn't belong in a neighborhood that smelled like fresh-cut grass. Luca stepped through the threshold first, his face pale. Behind him stood the man I had only seen in the ledger, the architect. The man who truly owned the city's concrete. "Silas Vane," the architect said, his voice like dry parchment. "You destroyed a century of order for a girl and a wallet. Now you're going to fix it." I stepped between Silas and the men. My heart wasn't racing anymore, it was cold. I had spent my life being invisible, but in this room, under the flickering kitchen light, I was the only one who saw the truth. Silas wasn't a king and I wasn't a victim. We were the leverage. "He's not fixing anything," I said. "The city isn't a machine you can just restart. We've seen the guts of it. We've seen the ledger." The architect looked at me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "The ledger is gone, little girl." Silas snapped the card. "But you have the memory of a ghost. You lived in the tunnels. You saw the transactions. You are the ledger now." Silas stood up, his hand reaching for the knife hidden under the table. But I put my hand on his arm, stopping him. I looked at the architect and realized that the only way to protect this house was to set the city on fire one last time. "I'll give you what you want," I whispered. "But the price isn't money. It's the total erasure of the Vane name. You leave this house and we never existed. If I see a black SUV within 10 miles of this zip code, I'll leak the names I have stored in my head to the only person more dangerous than you, the public." The architect's smile vanished. He realized then that he wasn't dealing with a homeless girl anymore. He was dealing with the only person who knew how to live in the dark and still see everything. He nodded once and turned to leave. As the sedans roared away, Silas pulled me into his arms. We stood in the ruins of our kitchen, the scent of gunpowder and lilies mixing in the air. We knew the peace was over, but the war was finally ours to control. I looked at the ring on my finger, then at the orange cat curled up on the rug, and I knew that while we might always be ghosts, we were finally the ones haunting the world. If you believe that the girl who returned the wallet became the most powerful person in the city, hit the like button so her story reaches those who believe the forgotten are the ones to watch.